Welcome back. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa is set to travel to Canada from this weekend to attend and participate in the G7 Leaders Summit. The theme and purpose of this year's summit is to explore leadership and collaboration in driving a comprehensive approach to energy security with a focus on technology and innovation, diversification, and strengthening critical mineral supply chains and infrastructure and investment. Now, this, of course, comes as President Cyril Ramaphosa walked away from Washington in what many people would say was a small dose of a victory, given the ambush that he ran into the Oval Office with U.S. President Donald Trump. Joining us now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Oscar Van Heerden, who is from the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Van Heerden, always a pleasure having you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for us.
Dr. Van Heerden, I mean, it's fair to say, isn't it, that given how President Cyril Ramaphosa conducted himself at the Oval Office a few weeks ago, he heads into this G7 summit with more political maturity than he ever had before.
No, definitely. I mean, I think that is certainly the case. And remember, it's not, the invitation is actually from the Prime Minister of Canada. And as you know, he himself recently also had his little sideshow at the Oval Office. So I'm sure that when Ramaphosa and he meets, I'm sure on the sidelines they will have a little giggle about that too.
Dr. Van Heerden, let's talk about President Ramaphosa and, of course, the fact that South Africa is hosting this G20 later on this year. When you look at the way Ramaphosa has been portrayed as this honest broker, this is something maybe the world is looking at, isn't it? That when they see South Africa, they've got a country that has this moral obligation, given, of course, what is happening at the ICJ, but also the fact that Ramaphosa himself is playing such a key role in trying to find a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine in that ongoing war.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the overriding themes for this G7 meeting is indeed global peace and security. And I think within that context, the world leaders are definitely going to be interacting with President Ramaphosa to talk about what is it that he can do to also facilitate. Remember, anyone that understands the ins and outs of that war will know that the European Union members are not honest brokers necessarily. They are, in fact, encouraging the war to continue. France, Germany, and the UK is particularly outspoken about pushing back against Russia. Trump is claiming that he wants peace, but it seems that he himself is unable to broker the peace because he's also not an honest broker in the sense that the United States, the intelligence services, and so forth are still supporting Ukraine. So in a sense, I think world leaders will appreciate that it was actually foresight on the part of the African delegation, spearheaded by President Ramaphosa, to also go and see if they can intervene and if they can facilitate peace. And I think that is a conversation that's going to be had in Canada.
Dr. Van Heerden, energy. So we've got Washington under Trump that is clearly intent on keeping fossil fuels. We've got the rest of Europe that wants to go green. South Africa wants to go green. This is going to be interesting, isn't it? Given that you've got one of the G7 that is saying fossil fuels, fossil fuels, fossil fuels, or this other, although his famous statement, drill, baby, drill. So it's going to be quite interesting how the discussion of energy is going to take place over this weekend.
You know, we must be reminded of the G7 meeting under Justice Trudeau in 2018. When the world leaders of the G7 came with a communique at the end, and it was completely blasted by President Trump. You know, he took issue, he distanced himself from it. I think they're going to try and avoid something similar, especially given the disruptive nature of President Donald Trump. I'm not sure how they are going to coach the communique, but one thing for sure, all the members are in disagreement with President Trump and fossil fuels. Drill, baby, drill is not going to be the understanding at the G7. So they're going to have to do some fancy footwork if they do indeed want Donald Trump to be part of the communique and so forth. It's something akin to South Africa having to play the game if they really want to see Donald Trump attending the G20 Leaders Summit in November here in South Africa.
Dr. Van Heerden, let's shift to Africa, of course. Part of what President Ramaphosa is going to try and do is, of course, ask not just for assistance in Africa, but that drive of investment within the continent. It seems Europe is more likely to want to go ahead and be that strategic partner for the continent, given that US President Donald Trump is practically ignoring the continent. And many of those within Europe are part of that G7. And many of the African leaders look to President Ramaphosa to be that spearheaded figure. That's going to be the case, isn't it? And one may look at Ramaphosa to go ahead and continue that drive for the continent itself.
No, absolutely. I mean, the foreign policy of the South African government is very clear. It's, of course, looking at the national interest of South Africa, but placing Africa top of the agenda in all multilateral fora. And I think President Ramaphosa has proven time and time again that he does put Africa first. And I think it's going to be no exception this time around. It's about debt solutions. Remember, the continent is in serious debt. Some African countries are crippled by the external debt. So Ramaphosa has already made it part of the G20 agenda to try and ask that countries from the G7, the largest economies in the world, come to the party and do debt relief, do debt forgiveness, write-offs and so forth. So I think he's going to try and push that agenda at this meeting as well, to try and prepare leaders for the November summit, but also in terms of climate and climate disasters that are happening in the global south, particularly in Africa. I think he's also made it a point that they want to find sustainable solutions. Of course, South Africa has taken a multi-pronged approach. We have a mixed energy solution because of our vast numbers of coal, but at least there's a commitment to a green, just transition. And so it's also about saying you made certain commitments. Where is the money?
Dr. Van Heerden, one final question. Every time you hear President Ramaphosa speaking, whether it's at BRICS, whether it's at the UN General Assembly, a lot of it has come down to multipolarity. And this is the world that he would like to envision. BRICS is slowly starting to change that. Is the G7, in your view, Dr. Van Heerden, willing to embrace multipolarity, given you've got this far-right increase within Europe, and you've got US President Donald Trump, where you really don't know what to expect from him, but yet you expect the worst to come from him?
No, absolutely. This is the fight to be had. It's South Africa, it's the majority of countries in the BRICS formation, it's the global south, all understanding that the future, now that there has been a realization that globalization as a system is no longer the way forward. Now there is an emphasis that needs to be placed on multilateralism, multilateral organizations. We need to strengthen multilateral organizations. We see, for example, the withdrawal of Trump from the Paris Accord. We see him undermining the World Trade Organization with these tariffs that he has imposed and weaponizing trade. So the fight is on. Ironically, democracies like the United States are anti-multilateralism, and yet countries that is being purported to be authoritarian like China and Russia are ones that are arguing for multilateralism. So it's an interesting period that we are in the international system. But I do think the majority of G7 countries understand that the world has fundamentally changed, that the economies are much more integrated, and that the dominance and hegemony of the West is no longer the purview of only the strongest economist. And so multilateralism is certainly the way forward.
Dr. Van Heerden, absolute pleasure always having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Dr. Oscar Van Heerden from the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg. Up next, I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Hassan Jabarin. He's coming to us from Haifa. We're going to be discussing the 4 of the 12 activists that have been released from Israeli prisons. What is the fate of the other 8? That conversation is up next.